Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today, in historical terminology, we're going to talk about language and kind of the development and spread of it across the globe. Language is kind of the reason that we're able to do all this sort of thing, and it's something that um, we'll talk a little bit about this later in the video, but especially spoken language is something that's kind of built in to human DNA. It's something that's important, that kind of sets us apart from um, other species on our planet. So let's get started talking about the development and spread of language and how that's kind of affected our history. So to start, we need to kind of set the guidelines of what exactly is language. Language, right, is a structured system of communication. So language is the primary mode of communication for humans, and it can be conveyed through speech, like talking, sign, like sign language, or writing. Human languages rely on social convention to learn, and that basically means that we have to learn languages from others. Right? When we're born, we don't just know a language, we have to pick it up from our parents or the other people around us. So we learn to speak, we learn to communicate by watching others. There's been an estimated 5,000 to 7,000 languages in the history of the world, which is kind of crazy to think about, right? Think about all the billions and billions and billions of people who have existed, right? They've only spoken 5 to 7,000 languages. The study of language is called linguistics, and it's been studied and thought about since ancient times with the likes of Plato, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant, each dedicating some time to the subject, right? Those philosophers, they talk and think about so many different things, but they all have talked about and thought about linguistics, which is kind of cool. It's one of the things that great minds have always kind of thought about. So let's talk a little bit also about what the components of language are. Language, like all other things, right, has these certain pieces and parts that are important to understand. So, for example, the structure of language is referred to as grammar, and the individual components are vocabulary. Language, especially human ones, don't actually depend on a single mode of transmission, and it's highly variable between culture and time. So that means that language doesn't necessarily just have to be spoken word. It can be lots of different things together. And languages also depend on productivity and displacement. These are both linguistic terms. So productivity is kind of like the comparison of grammatical processes, and displacement is the ability to discuss things that are not immediately in front of us, which is something unique that our languages have. Speech, okay, is one of the first types of languages we'll talk about today. Spoken language is a system dependent on articulate sounds instead of the written word, right? So just grunting at people doesn't really communicate anything, right? We have a certain articulate sounds that we have assigned meaning to, and that's why it has become a language. So spoken language relies on context, not context. Although I guess you can have context in spoken language, but context is the word I was supposed to type there, to convey meaning. So words meaning can change when it's surrounded with other words or different surroundings or based on the situation you're in, right? So, if you're talking about something that's really cool or something that you really enjoy and you say that's fire, right? Or if you're in a different place and there's something burning and you're like that's fire, right? That meaning changes because of the situation and the surroundings which you're speaking. So that's what's kind of cool about spoken language, is that context changes the meaning of the things we say. Words are also made up of a limited set of vowel and consonant sounds, and we also infer different tones when we're speaking to change the meaning of what we're saying, right? When you ask a question, you might have that kind of, that emphasis at the end near the question mark, like, why are you doing that? Or, may I have a brownie? Right? That different kind of tone conveys a different message. Spoken language is also acquired by hearing the language around you. Like I mentioned, right, you have to hear people say it. If you take a language in a classroom, right, you can't just learn it from a book. You've got to actually be speaking it, or you're not going to remember it. It's kind of just how our brains work. Here are some really cool pictures about language and how it's changed over the years. So over here we have a language map of old world languages. that shows kind of how the different languages have spread since a long time ago. We've got over here a map with all the different language families in the world. And then over here, we've got the history of the English language and how it's changed. Right, we're over here in the late modern English section, right? But English has been changing and growing since 200 BC. So that's pretty cool that change has happened. I also have a link down here, which I will put in the video description, so you can come and look at these charts. It's on a website, so you can go look at all. There's 23 different maps and charts that you can take a peek at if you're interested. Some interesting other things we want to say when we're talking about spoken language. Spoken language can also be given more context from non-spoken words. Body language, conversation norms, and dialects all play a factor into spoken language. Body language, right, is meaning conveyed through how your body is positioned and your facial expressions. Conversation norms are like the unwritten rules about how you speak with others. And dialects are the changes in spoken language based on your location or cultural difference, right? If you talk to somebody in Boston or New York, right, they're going to have different accents, different dialects, different words for different things. Right? If you go down south, they're going to have a different dialect. If you go to France, the different areas of France have different dialects of French, right? They're all speaking French, but it's going to be slightly different based on the area that you're in. And that changes everything, right? When it changes context, it changes meaning, right? An example of this, right, is my French teacher in high school. She studied abroad in France, and she had a host family, and she was out hanging out with one of her friends, and someone asked her something using the verb sortir, which means to go. So she understood that from her book learning, right? That sortir means, they're asking me to go somewhere with them. And what it actually means in modern slang French is, would you like to kiss me? And so she was very confused when he tried to kiss her after that, and realized this whole thing had happened, right? So conversation norms, dialects, different styles, all that thing changes the meaning of language, which is why it's so interesting. And that's why we're talking about it today, because that's cool. Of course, we could also not, go much further without talking kind of about the origin of spoken language. And scientists have found that the origin of language is kind of a difficult question to answer, right? Unlike our genetic cousins like apes and monkeys, humans use our tongues, lips, and other movable parts in our mouth to create speech, unlike them. So chimpanzees, monkeys, and apes, they don't have as complex of a mouth as we do, so they aren't able to make the full range of sounds we make, which is why their language is a lot different than ours. What scientists can say is that humanity's desire to live closer to water in the past helped us develop the structures in our mouth that made us able to speak. So, for instance, our larger brains, which we may have gotten from the brain nutrients that come with fish, voluntary breathing, so our ability to stop breathing if we wish to, and suction feeding off of seafoods have kind of helped our body evolve the closed row teeth and the globular tongues that have helped us make these noises and make language more possible. So there's some evolutionary biology that's kind of going into the potential of where language is coming from, right, in the history of the earth. Let's move over to the second type of language we're going to talk about today, which is written language. And written language, right, is represented as a representation of spoken language with some sort of writing system, which usually has some sort of symbols, right? When you go to school, you learn the alphabet, you learn how to make all your letters, right? Those are the symbols that we use now, but those symbols have changed over time. Written language is an invention, and it must be taught to children, which is why it's difficult for kids to learn how to write. Reading comes much easier than writing does, because speaking and learning language that way comes much easier to us than reading and writing, because the symbology and all of that is something that's invented. It's not a natural component of our brains. That's why it's so much harder for kids to learn those sorts of things. written language can only exist, right, as a complement to a spoken language. So, I mean, I guess technically you could make up a written language without any real spoken language to back it up, but it's going to be in some way tied to that spoken language, right? Even if you're making up a code language as a child, right? It's still going to be in some way tied to your spoken tongue, because you have to make those written things mean something, and that meaning is going to come from the spoken language, right? No natural language is purely written. A natural language being one that is that has been generated from humanity. This is why learning to read and write, right, of course, is more difficult to us. Speaking is a natural thing that we have been able to do, and it's something that our brain and our bodies are wired for, while writing is something that we have invented, and so it's something learned, and that's what makes it so much more difficult. So here's some examples of writing maps and examples. So you can see here are the first sources of writing really came in Mesopotamia, and then other places kind of developed writing based off of those areas. So like Egyptian hieroglyphics are connected in a way to Mesopotamia. Over here, we've got different writing sections in the Asia Minor, and you can kind of see how different things break off. This over here is a picture of cuneiform. So this is the writing found in Sumeria. There's tons of these tablets, and they're all kind of super boring and mundane. It's mostly just counting stuff, but it exists, right? So that's cool. And then down here is a picture of Egyptian hieroglyphics. The first full-blown writing system was based off of proto-writing, which is kind of like not quite a grammatical structure. There's not quite, like vocabulary and stuff. It's a little bit less advanced than full-blown writing, but they were developed around the Neolithic era in the 7th millennia BCE. That's when those proto-writings were happening. And then the first actual real writing systems were implemented in Egypt, Sumeria, Crete, and China, and they had their own, grammar and vocabulary and stuff like that, and they were all called different things, like hieroglyphics, cuneiform. Crete, they're just called symbols, I believe, and then in China, they're characters. Greek and then Latin script became the main modes of written language in the classical period, and then Arabic became more popular in the Middle Ages with the rise of Islam and the Islamic Golden Age. And since then, the Latin and Cyrillic alphabets are now kind of the two main alphabets that are used around the globe, since they were expanded to codify the different phonologies of various spoken languages in the Middle Ages. Latin, right, that vocabulary, that alphabet was much smaller during Roman times, but then when different vernaculars spread across Europe and people weren't speaking Latin as their main language anymore, the alphabets were expanded to make sure we had all the different sounds in it. And now we have the alphabets we have today. The final language we're going to talk about is sign language. And unlike spoken and written language, they rely on a visual manual modality to express meaning. So you have to watch and create signs with your hands or other body parts. Sign language, unlike written languages, can be considered natural languages by linguists since they have their own grammar and lexicon. Right there, you can have a sign language with assigned meanings that don't necessarily tie into a spoken language, right? Sign languages are mostly used by deaf and hard of hearing people, but there's a growing community of hearing individuals who are also beginning to learn these languages as well. And what's really cool is that sign language has actually been taught to different apes and monkeys, as well as human babies, as a ways for them to communicate. So one of my friends taught simple sign language to her baby. So when she was hungry, she could say, "I'm hungry." Or if she was tired, she could say, "I'm tired," using the signs, right? Because she couldn't speak yet, she couldn't make words, but she could move her fingers and ask for things that way. So that's a pretty cool thing that we've learned. Apes and monkeys have learned up to 60 to 80 words in sign language. Makes it really easy for us to communicate with them. Some pretty interesting work there if you want to look into that, kind of what we've been teaching apes and monkeys so that we can more easily communicate with them. Sign languages have actually been in use for most of history, which I found interesting. I didn't know that. The very first historical mention of a sign language was by Plato, who theorized about signed languages for the hard of hearing, or if humans were born without tongues, that's how humans would get along and communicate if they would use a sign language of some sort. Excuse me one second. Pardon me. Most early sign languages used finger spelling systems, which were just ways to communicate the alphabet to people who could hear, the first of which, right, was documented in the 1500s. So basically, it was just kind of a way for these people who were hard of hearing or deaf to fit in to the written and spoken languages of the area. And this started in the 1500s, but now modern sign language is often can often be tied to a spoken language, but they are also, like they said, could be a natural language with their own meanings that does not necessarily tie to any spoken language. And so now people who can't learn spoken language, right, can still communicate with people who are able to hear. Before we go, we do want to talk about endangered languages. Since we're talking about the history of language, it's probably important to talk about this too. And there are some languages that are endangered, much like animals or cultures. And there's a risk that these languages will disappear as their native speaking populations die. Although languages have died throughout history, the rate at which this is happening has accelerated due to factors like globalization, imperialism, colonialism, and linguicide, or the purposeful death or killing of a language. Currently, 96% of the world's languages are spoken by only 4% of the world's population, with many languages having less than 10,000 speakers, which is crazy to think about, right? And it's also crazy to think about the extent at which all the main languages have kind of taken over our lives. It's really cool that it makes it easier for us to communicate, that we're all speaking mostly the same languages, but it's also kind of sad that these native cultural languages are being driven to extinction. There are so many endangered languages on all the continents, but just to give off a few so you can kind of see what it is that I'm talking about. In Africa, the Bolo language, Moroccan Judeo-Arabic language, Ziri and Sioux are some examples of languages that are that are endangered or on the close to extinction. In Asia, the Mughal, Assyrian, Yiddish, Ainu, Western Armenian, and Damari languages are endangered. In Europe, Romani, Crees, Belarusian, Flemish, Lorraine, Saxon, Basque, and Judish are some examples of languages that are becoming closer to being extinct. In North America, these are mostly indigenous languages. Beaver, Inuit, Oneida, Seneca, Louisiana Creole, and Menominee are languages that are endangered. In South America, Itza, Boruca, Mapuche, I can't pronounce that one. I'm sorry. I'm not even going to try it. Yora and Yabarna. And then the Pacific Islands, Savo, Tianu, Norian, Maori, Rutuman, Tavulin, and Hawaiian are all languages that are also endangered. And there are scientists and anthropologists that are working to try to preserve these languages, at least within tapes, so that we have them preserved. We can still study them, but they are probably going to end up being dead languages, which are languages that exist, but nobody speaks, conversationally anymore. They're just studied by, scholars and stuff like that. Finally, we're also going to talk a little bit about modern language adaptations. Modern technology and the ease of communication through digital devices has really changed how written and spoken language occurs in humans, especially among the youth of the world, right? Abbreviations, emoticons, text speech are all changing the way that humans interact and communicate with each other. And linguists have been studying these changes as they happen. And these digital languages have unique grammatical structures, and they oftentimes bleed into the spoken and written language that they are originally based off, right? We use words like LOL. We use things like that in everyday language now, even though they were originally just in like AIM and texting. Words like LOL, meme, whatevs, there's lots of examples, right, are words that have jumped from the digital sphere to the spoken and written English language, and more continue to happen as our language evolves and our culture changes. So the impact that this technology has had on our language is really interesting, and it's something that linguists have been studying as well, since our language is changing so much more rapidly at this point. Sometimes to the detriment, right? The grammatical structure of proper English, as people might say, has broken down. But a linguist might say that's because we don't speak proper English anymore. Now we speak this modern text English hybrid, which does have its own unique grammar style. And so these young people are writing and speaking in this hybrid language instead of proper English. So there you go. Academia. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching Historical Terminology. I hope you learned something about language and its importance in the history of the planet. Like I've always said, if there's something you want to learn about, something you find interesting that we haven't covered yet on the channel, if you drop a comment with a suggestion, I can make a video about whatever it is you want to learn about. I love having feedback, and I would love to have a suggestion. So, I mean, I got more ideas, so don't worry about that. But if you have something that you really want to learn about, you want to hear about, let me know. Anyway, thanks again, and we hope to see you next time when we do some more historical terminology. Peace.